Hello guys, if you're watching this video, then most probably you are going to build yourself a Voron 0, and this is the first video of my build series, which is assembling the frame. Voron 0 doesn't use hammer nuts or T-nuts to hold your linear carriages onto the rails. Instead of that, it uses these spacers. These adapters, which you fill with the hex nuts and put into the extrusion, and then you put your linear rail on top. So first of all, let's take these 5 adapters and fill them with nuts. We need to fill each other hole, so you don't need to fill them all. So the first extrusion we're gonna fill is this one. It is called E extrusion. The E extrusion is a full length extrusion with one hole on one end, which is located pretty far away. It's like 3 centimeters from the edge of the extrusion. We'll need 2 of them, and we will fill and we will install 2 nut adapters inside. Remember that you shouldn't push the nut adapters on top, because you want your nuts to be under the adapter. So if I'm filling this extrusion, I should put the adapter below. So when I turn it around, the nuts don't fall off. Let's take 2 linear rails, pre-align them. So what do you have to do now? You must have a caliper or a ruler or another device that you can mark 39 millimeters on, and then ensure that the edge of your linear rail is 39 millimeters away from the edge of the extrusion. And the distance should be measured on that side of the extrusion which has that one hole. So you see, here's a hole, this one. I have 39 millimeters here. I push the extrusion, the linear rail 39 millimeters away, and at this point I can start tightening the screws. Before tightening the screws, I will have to install these 2 spacers, so I'm sure that my linear rail is in line with the extrusion. So let's add the spacers. Let's measure 39 millimeters again. And let's tighten the screws. Again, do not over tighten them. There is a nut which is held by a tiny piece of plastic, and if you over tighten them, they will just destroy this piece of plastic, and you'll have to print everything from scratch. Again, do not over tighten, because basically what you have there is a tiny piece of plastic with all the nuts pressed in, and if you apply too much force, this will result in nuts breaking the plastic and getting loose. So again, 39 millimeters, and let's tighten the screws. You might have to turn the extrusion around so you can catch the nut, but be careful so your carriage doesn't fall off. Actually, when I get the first 2 screws, I will install the blocker back so the carriage stays in place. For XZ, you will need 2 extrusions which have 2 holes symmetrically on both sides of the extrusion, and you should repeat the same process by installing the spacers. The distance, however, is a bit different here, because you will need to move the linear rail 33 millimeters, not 38 millimeters away. When you have measured the distance, you can tighten the screws, again not over tightening them. The next step is the bed carrier, this part here, and it should utilize 2 extrusions installed here, and a third one which is connected perpendicularly on the edge of these 2 extrusions. Normally there are 2 types of extrusion, one with holes and 2 without. So those without holes come here, and those with holes get to the end, but Voron drilled holes in all the 3 of them, so okay, you can use any. Let's start with 2 M3 12mm screws, ball head screws, and these ball head screws should be put into the thread on the edge of the extrusion. Put on the carrier, drop in these 2 screws and tighten them. I'm not putting any thread lock because, as I see, there is no strict requirement to do that. When you got these 2 screws, it's time to tighten 2 more. This will be M3 8mm, and you will need 2 nuts that should be installed under these 2 holes. In my case, for format kits and this kind of nuts, spacers, whatever. So let's slide them in and tighten with 2 8mm M3 screws. Now you should take another pair of 8mm M3 nuts and screw them into the extrusions and to the opposite side of the extrusion, but not all the way in. So when I have these 2 screws installed, again not all the way in, I'm sliding the extrusion on top of them until the heads of the screws are aligned with the holes in the extrusion. Then I will have to use an Allen key to carefully tighten the screws here through the holes in the extrusion. And let's recheck the alignment once again. Okay, each next step is getting trickier and trickier, so feel free and do consult the manual and not only this video. Next step is to prepare 2 B-type extrusions. So these are extrusions with no holes. And by preparing, I mean inserting, first of all, inserting 2 10mm M3 screws on the threaded parts of the extrusion from both sides, and putting 2 M3 nuts inside each of the extrusion. And 1 and 2. When the nuts are in, you need to add 4 6mm ball head screws, 2 side nuts, and of course don't over tighten them because you will have to slide the Z extrusions on top of these nuts, on top of the screws. So what should I do at this point? I should take one of the prepared extrusions and slide the Z extrusions on top of the ball head screws so they fit inside the extrusion. And I should tighten them a bit. The final tightening and final alignment will happen later. And I should tighten them so I'm able to move them with a little bit of force back and forth. Once the bottom is done, I'll have to preload another 3 nuts in each of the extrusion. So add 3 M3 nuts. There should be 3 nuts in each extrusion. If you're using direct feed setup, and if you're using bowdoin, you will have to add 5 nuts into each extrusion. Repeat the same process with the top extrusion, so just gently slide the extrusion over the ball head screws. 1 and 2. Now I have to find H extrusions, which will be the side extrusions for this back plate. H extrusions are 20cm extrusions with 2 holes on the end. So 1 and 2. Again, slide them over the ball head screws and slightly tighten the ball head screws using the Allen key. So let's do the alignment. First of all, we need to make sure that all these angles are 90 degrees. How do I do that? As you see, the extrusions currently are not tightened yet, and they move freely back and forth. So what do? I take another piece of extrusion and I push the top extrusion as strong as possible against this one extrusion, and then I'm tightening the ball head screw hidden in the extrusion. So now it's firm. We'll repeat the same step with this corner. So once the frame is done, let's align these two extrusions. And yeah, it's time for another measurement. First distance is 59 millimeters, and it should be the distance between the edge of this extrusion, not the end, edge of this extrusion, and the side of this one. So I'll try to align it as precisely as possible. So 59 millimeters here. Now I'll just add 15 millimeters to 59. This will be 73 millimeters. And I will measure from the edge of this extrusion. 73.1, 73.2, 1, 2, and let's tighten the screws. The next distance is the distance between these two extrusions, and it should be 54 millimeters. So let's measure 54 millimeters and let's just push them together. And if my measurements are correct, there should be a 73 millimeter distance, the same as here on the other side of the extrusion. Let's check it out. 73? Yeah, 73. Let's now install carriage blockers. These are 4 small blocks, which should be put in place with the help of M3 8mm screws. So 4 8mm bolted screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 M3 nuts, and I will just slide them in. Okay, this is getting colorful. If you hold the frame with this big gap on top, then there are 2 mounts, one with tongue, another without, and the one with the tongue should be on the right side. So like this, and like this. There are 4 screws, obviously, to fix into the carriage, and there is a very tiny hole which will allow you to access the screws here. Also, you will need the thread lock. Take 8 M2 8mm screws. I will use the blue one, medium strength, which is considered immovable. And to make everything a bit simpler, I will just install all the screws on the mounts. Apply the thread locker, and only then I will try to install it. It's hard to see, but they are. Then I will apply a tiny bit of the thread lock, and let's attach the screws. A little bit of thread lock. Okay, this still moves. So when you have both carriers attached, let's preload some nuts into the carrier itself. First of all, we have to preload 2 nuts here in this part of extrusion, 1 and 2. Then you have to preload another 2 nuts here, and when you pick inside, you should pick this one with 2 screws. So 1 and 2. This will be used to attach the carrier itself, so I'm aligning them with the holes in the carrier mounts, something like this and this, here and here. And you should preload 6 more nuts on the back side of the carrier. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. At this point I don't hope to align them, of course, I'm just distributing them a bit. Okay, so if we are having this side with a larger gap on top, then we should install the carrier with the screws on the bottom and with this big hole on top. So big gap on top, big hole on top, and just push it into the carrier mount. Sorry. As soon as you've done that, you should take 2 8mm screws and attach first 2 nuts. At this point you should check that your carrier freely moves, because if it doesn't, it means that your linear rails are not parallel and this should be fixed. Take another 2 8mm screws and try to fix them here. So in hole 1 and in hole 2. The most tricky part is to secure 4 of the 6 nuts you preloaded here. So 2 nuts should stay in the center and 2 nuts should go here. 1 nut here, second nut here. I suppose it will take me a bit of time to catch them. You should have a pair of tweezers if you want to assemble the Voron. I mean Voron 0, because without the tweezers it's a nightmare, sorry. And double check, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 screws fixed in and 2 nuts in the middle. At this point you should be able to move the carrier back and forth without extra sound or major resistance. If this is not the case, you should loosen these 2 screws on one side and try to readjust the frame, and again loosen only one side, another side should be fixed, and double check all the distances again. So 59mm here, 54mm here. If there are no issues with the carriage, you should remove these 2 frames, 2 extrusions, because these were attached just to assemble the frame, to assemble it, you know, pretty and square. So loosen the screws and remove the side extrusions.